When the first reports of the P-51 Mustang filtered into German intelligence channels, they did not trigger alarm. On paper, the aircraft did not look revolutionary. It was fast, but not unprecedented. It was sleek, but lightly armed by late war standards. Early variants lacked the altitude performance and firepower that defined Germany's frontline interceptors. To experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, it looked like another Allied experiment, interesting but not decisive. This reaction was shaped by context. By 1942, German fighter pilots had already faced a wide range of Allied aircraft. Many were inferior. Some were competent. Few had fundamentally altered air combat. German confidence rested on experience, not arrogance. They had fought and defeated earlier Allied fighters over France, the Channel, and the early bomber streams. The assumption was simple. The Allies were improving, but not fast enough to overturn German qualitative advantages. The early Mustang reinforced that belief. Initial P-51 variants, powered by the Allison engine, performed well at low altitude, but lost power rapidly higher up. German pilots rarely fought at low altitude over Germany. The air war was fought at bomber heights, where performance, climb rate, and sustained speed mattered most. At those altitudes, the early Mustang did not impress. It was assigned to reconnaissance and ground attack roles rather than air superiority. That assignment shaped perception. German pilots judged aircraft by how they behaved in combat, not by theoretical potential. The early Mustang did not challenge Luftwaffe doctrine or tactics. It did not escort bombers deep into Germany. It did not contest the airspace where German fighters made their kills. As a result, it was categorized mentally as a secondary type, useful to the enemy, but not a threat to German control of the air. There was also doctrinal bias. The Luftwaffe believed that bomber destruction, not fighter-fighter duels, would decide the air war. Fighters existed to intercept bombers efficiently, climb quickly, and deliver concentrated firepower. Endurance was less valued. Long-range escort was not considered decisive because German planners assumed bombers could be broken before escorts mattered. In that framework, a fighter optimized for range seemed unnecessary. This assumption extended to aircraft design philosophy. German fighters emphasized climb rate, acceleration, and high-altitude performance over endurance. Fuel capacity was minimized to reduce weight and improve handling. This produced lethal interceptors, but it also limited operational radius. German pilots accepted this trade-off because they believed the fight would come to them. The idea that an escort fighter could follow bombers all the way to the target and back was considered impractical. The Mustang challenged this assumption quietly, without announcing itself. Its defining feature was not speed or firepower, but range. That trait did not register immediately as dangerous. Range was useful, but only if paired with combat performance at altitude. Until that pairing existed, German pilots saw no reason to reassess. Another factor was timing. When the Mustang first appeared, the Luftwaffe was still fighting on multiple fronts. Resources were strained, but confidence remained. Losses were mounting, yet German pilots still believed skill, tactics, and superior aircraft design could offset numerical disadvantage. New Allied fighters were expected. Decisive Allied fighters were not. Even Allied usage reinforced German misjudgment. Early Mustangs were flown primarily by the RAF in roles that did not highlight their potential. They were fast reconnaissance aircraft and capable low-level attackers. These missions did not force German fighters into unfavorable engagements. The Mustang's strengths remained latent. The shift came with an engine change, but the consequences of that change were not immediately obvious to German observers. Aircraft development during the war was constant. New variants appeared regularly on both sides. Most represented incremental improvement. German intelligence did not assume that one modification would transform the strategic air war. German pilots were also conditioned by visual cues. The Mustang did not look threatening in the way heavy fighters or cannon-armed interceptors did. Its lines were clean, its profile slender. It did not resemble the armored, heavily armed aircraft the Luftwaffe associated with danger. Visual impression mattered more than it should have. This dismissal was reinforced by combat habits. German pilots evaluated enemy aircraft by how quickly they could destroy them. Early encounters with Mustangs did not produce alarming results. Losses occurred, but not at rates that suggested systemic danger. The Mustang did not yet dominate engagements. It blended into the background of a crowded aerial battlefield. What German pilots underestimated was not the aircraft's current performance, but the system it was about to enable. The Mustang was not designed to win isolated dogfights. It was designed to solve a problem that had crippled Allied bombing strategy: escort range. Until that problem was solved, German fighters could attack bombers with relative freedom. Once it was solved, the entire balance of the air war would shift. The Luftwaffe did not see this coming because it evaluated threats tactically rather than systemically. It asked whether the Mustang could defeat German fighters one-on-one. It did not ask what would happen if German fighters were forced to fight constantly, everywhere, without respite, against escorts that never turned back. That misjudgment was subtle. It did not look like a mistake at first. There was no single moment of realization. The Mustang did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived quietly, efficiently, and in growing numbers. German pilots laughed because they believed they understood the battlefield. They believed they had seen every Allied trick. They believed the air war would remain a contest of interception and attrition at bomber altitudes, close to home. They did not realize that the battlefield itself was about to expand, and that endurance, not just performance, would decide who survived it. By the time the Mustang revealed its true role, laughter had turned into urgency, and urgency in the air war usually came too late. The turning point was not a dogfight, it was geography. When the Mustang began escorting bomber formations all the way to their targets and back, German pilots encountered a situation they had never faced before. For the first time in the air war over Europe, there was no predictable edge to the fight, no safe withdrawal zone, no moment when escort fighters turned away and left bombers exposed. The battlefield no longer had a boundary. Before this shift, German interception doctrine was built around timing and distance. Fighters climbed to altitude, intercepted bombers, inflicted losses, then disengaged. Escorts were a problem, but a temporary one. They ran out of fuel. They turned back. German pilots waited for that moment. It had been reliable. The Mustang erased that moment. With long-range fuel capacity and consistent high-altitude performance, the aircraft did not merely accompany bombers to the outskirts of German airspace. It stayed with them over industrial targets, over flak belts, over the most heavily defended regions of the Reich, and then escorted them home. German pilots who attacked at any point along that route now faced opposition. This changed the tempo of combat immediately. Interceptions became continuous rather than episodic. German fighters could no longer choose the most favorable moment to engage. Every climb, every approach, every disengagement risked interception by fresh escort fighters that were not constrained by fuel limits in the same way earlier escorts had been. The Mustang's impact was systemic. It did not need to outperform German fighters in every parameter. It needed to deny them rest. German pilots began flying more sorties per day under worse conditions. Takeoffs and climbs were contested. Engagements occurred farther from home bases. Retreats were no longer safe. A damaged aircraft that might once have limped back under escort cover now faced pursuit all the way to landing. Losses mounted not just in combat, but during disengagement. The Mustang also altered engagement geometry. Earlier escorts tended to remain close to bomber formations, prioritizing defense over initiative. The Mustang's range allowed escort fighters to range ahead, above, and around bomber streams. This expanded the protective envelope and turned escort fighters into hunters rather than guards. German pilots suddenly found themselves intercepted while forming up, while climbing, or while attempting to reposition for an attack. The initiative shifted. Instead of German fighters dictating when and where combat occurred, Mustangs began forcing engagements on their terms. This had immediate tactical consequences. German pilots burned fuel faster maneuvering defensively. They expended ammunition fighting escorts before reaching bombers. Many never reached bomber formations at all. Others arrived disorganized, low on energy, and at a disadvantage. Bomber losses declined not because bombers became tougher, but because attackers were degraded before contact. The psychological effect was severe. Luftwaffe pilots had trained for interception, not attrition, under constant pressure. The Mustang imposed a form of aerial exhaustion. Every mission carried risk from start to finish. Even successful engagements were costly in fuel, time, and concentration. Fatigue accumulated. The aircraft's performance envelope mattered here. At high altitude, the Mustang could maintain speed and maneuverability long enough to stay engaged. It was not a brief presence. It lingered. German pilots could not simply outweight it. Crucially, the Mustang also interacted with numbers. Allied production ensured that escorts were not only present, but plentiful. A German pilot might evade one engagement only to encounter another. Even if the Mustang was not always superior in a one-on-one fight, it did not need to be. It needed to be there. Consistently. Relentlessly. Losses began to shift from bombers to fighters. German pilot attrition accelerated. Experienced pilots were lost at rates that training pipelines could not replace. Unlike earlier phases of the air war, where bomber crews absorbed the brunt of losses, now it was the interceptor force bleeding out. This had cascading effects. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours and less experience. They faced veteran escort pilots flying aircraft optimized for long missions and sustained combat. The skill gap widened. The Mustang did not create that gap alone, but it exploited it mercilessly. The air war also expanded vertically. Mustangs attacked fighters during climb when aircraft were most vulnerable. They exploited energy states. They forced German pilots to fight defensively rather than attack aggressively. Doctrine that emphasized quick interception and disengagement began to fail because disengagement was no longer guaranteed. Operationally, this forced German command to reconsider resource allocation. More fighters were needed to achieve the same interception results. More fuel was consumed. Maintenance demands increased. Airfields became targets, both physically and operationally. The cost of simply contesting airspace rose sharply. The Mustang also reduced the effectiveness of flak. Anti-aircraft fire had relied on fighters to disrupt bomber formations and force predictable flight paths. With escorts maintaining cohesion, bombers flew straighter, tighter formations. Flak remained dangerous, but it could not compensate for the loss of fighter effectiveness. Perhaps most damaging was the erosion of German pilot confidence. Pilots understood quickly what had changed. They talked among themselves. The old patterns were gone. The sky no longer belonged to anyone for even a moment. Every mission felt like a gamble, with worsening odds. The Mustang did not need to shoot down every German fighter to win. It needed to make every German sortie more expensive than the last. It did that by staying. This persistence transformed air combat from a series of clashes into a war of endurance. German aircraft could still fight. German pilots could still win individual engagements. But the strategic equation had shifted. Victory was no longer measured by bombers destroyed on a given day. It was measured by how long the interceptor force could continue operating under constant pressure. The answer was, not long enough. Once the Mustang reached the target, the air war ceased to be episodic and became continuous. That continuity favored the side with greater production, deeper pilot pools, and aircraft designed for range and reliability. Combat had begun in earnest, not because the Mustang was faster or deadlier in isolation, but because it made the sky inescapable. The arrival of the Mustang at every stage of the bomber mission did more than increase losses. It dismantled the logic of Luftwaffe doctrine piece by piece. German fighter tactics had been refined around interception: climb fast, strike hard, disengage safely, repeat. That cycle depended on three assumptions: limited escort range, predictable engagement windows, and secure recovery. The Mustang invalidated all three. Interception doctrine collapsed first. German fighters were optimized to reach bomber altitude quickly and attack in short, violent bursts. Time over target mattered less than position and timing. With escorts that turned back early, German pilots could choose when to commit. Once Mustang stayed, commitment became compulsory. Any approach toward the bomber stream invited escort contact. Any delay risked losing position. The carefully choreographed intercept turned into a scramble under pressure. This forced German pilots into unfavorable energy states. Instead of climbing cleanly and attacking with advantage, they were often intercepted during climb or forced to maneuver defensively before reaching bombers. Energy, altitude, and speed bled away before the primary task even began. Attacks that did reach bombers were rushed, poorly coordinated, and less effective. The second doctrinal pillar to fail was disengagement. Luftwaffe tactics assumed that once an attack was made, fighters could break off and return to base or reposition under relative safety. The Mustang followed. Disengagement now meant pursuit. Damaged aircraft that once might have survived were destroyed on the way home. Airfields, once sanctuaries, became dangerous as escorts pressed attacks to the edge of fuel limits. This had immediate behavioral effects. German pilots became reluctant to pursue deep engagements. They conserved fuel defensively. They broke off earlier than doctrine prescribed. Each of these decisions was rational in isolation. Collectively, they reduced effectiveness. Bombers survived not because they were invulnerable, but because attackers were constrained. The third pillar, predictability, collapsed more slowly but proved decisive. German planners had relied on patterns, bomber routes, escort limits, engagement zones. The Mustang disrupted patterns by extending escort coverage unpredictably. Escorts ranged ahead, split formations, baited interceptors, and forced combat far from planned zones. Planning cycles lagged behind reality. This doctrinal breakdown exposed training limits. Luftwaffe training emphasized interception skills, quick identification, attack geometry, and withdrawal. It did not prepare pilots for sustained escort combat across hundreds of miles. Endurance flying, long-duration situational awareness, and repeated engagements in a single sortie favored Allied pilots trained for exactly that environment. Attrition amplified every flaw. Experienced German pilots, already scarce, were lost faster. Replacements entered combat with fewer hours and less tactical depth. They faced opponents who not only had numerical advantage, but doctrinal coherence. The Mustang was part of a system that reinforced itself. Long-range escort protected bombers. Bomber survival sustained offensive pressure. Pressure forced continuous defense. Defense consumed pilots. Attempts to adapt doctrine midstream ran into structural barriers. German command experimented with massed attacks, head-on approaches, and altered formations. Some tactics achieved temporary success. None restored the old balance. Head-on attacks increased bomber losses, but also pilot casualties. Massing fighters required fuel and coordination that were increasingly unavailable. Every adaptation traded time and pilots for diminishing returns. The Mustang also changed the vertical dimension of combat. German fighters had once exploited altitude advantage. Now escorts contested the climb and the descent. Vertical maneuver ceased to be a safe domain. Engagements flattened into prolonged contests of endurance, numbers, and coordination, areas where the Luftwaffe was weakest by 1944. Operational consequences followed quickly. Sortie rates dropped. Maintenance backlogs grew as aircraft returned damaged or not at all. Fuel consumption soared as pilots maneuvered defensively over longer distances. Airfields were pressured constantly, reducing turnaround efficiency. The Luftwaffe was forced into a defensive posture that consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. The Mustang did not need to defeat every German fighter tactically. It needed to force the Luftwaffe to operate outside its design envelope. That is exactly what happened. Doctrine optimized for short, decisive engagements could not survive continuous, long-range pressure. By the time German command acknowledged the scale of the problem, solutions were limited. New aircraft types arrived too late. Fuel shortages constrained training and operations. Command decisions became reactive. The air war had shifted from contest to containment. Most telling was the change in mission outcomes. Bomber losses declined relative to sortie volume. Fighter losses rose relative to interception attempts. The exchange rate turned against the Luftwaffe. In an attritional war, exchange rates decide outcomes. The Mustang imposed a losing exchange rate relentlessly. German pilots still fought bravely. Individual skill did not vanish. But skill could not compensate for a doctrine whose assumptions had been invalidated. The Mustang forced German fighters to fight everywhere, all the time, without respite. That condition favored the side with greater depth, production, and training continuity. In practice, Luftwaffe doctrine did not fail because it was flawed in principle. It failed because it was designed for a different war, one with edges, pauses, and safe exits. The Mustang erased those features. The sky became continuous, hostile, and unforgiving. The laughter ended, not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with the realization that there was no longer a way back to the old rules. Every sortie confirmed it. Every loss reinforced it. Doctrine that could not adapt fast enough was ground down by persistence. Once the Mustang imposed continuous escort, the air war entered a phase the Luftwaffe was structurally unprepared to survive. The decisive mechanism was not a single tactical innovation or a sudden collapse in skill. It was attrition without relief. German fighter forces were forced to fight a war of persistence with tools designed for bursts, and the mismatch hollowed them out from the inside. Attrition had always existed, but its distribution changed. Earlier in the campaign, bomber crews absorbed disproportionate losses. Those losses were visible, dramatic, and politically salient. Fighter losses were steadier and more manageable. The Mustang reversed that balance. Losses shifted onto the interceptor force itself, onto pilots whose experience could not be replaced quickly, and onto aircraft that required time, fuel, and trained ground crews to keep operational. The critical change was sortie economics. German pilots now flew longer missions under constant threat. Each sortie consumed more fuel, generated more wear, and carried higher risk from takeoff to landing. Damage that once would have been survivable now resulted in losses during withdrawal. Abort rates increased. Aircraft returned riddled with holes, engines stressed, systems degraded. Maintenance crews worked longer hours for fewer flyable aircraft. This strained a system already under pressure. Fuel shortages, limited training hours. Reduced training produced pilots with fewer flight hours and less combat seasoning. Those pilots were then thrown into a sky dominated by veteran escort fighters flying aircraft optimized for endurance. The result was a widening skill gap. Losses accelerated precisely where the Luftwaffe could least afford them. Pilot attrition was the fulcrum. An experienced fighter pilot represented years of investment. Training pipelines could not keep pace with losses once the exchange rate turned. As veteran pilots fell, unit leadership thinned. Tactical cohesion suffered. New pilots flew fewer hours before combat and fewer missions before loss. The Luftwaffe became a force of diminishing returns. The Mustang intensified this by denying recovery windows. In earlier phases, lulls allowed reorganization. Units could stand down, retrain, and absorb replacements. Continuous escort erased those lulls. Bomber streams arrived regularly. Escorts were present consistently. There was no operational pause in which to rebuild. Pressure was constant, cumulative, and unforgiving. Operational choices compounded the problem. German command attempted to compensate by committing more fighters per interception. This increased immediate combat power, but worsened attrition. More aircraft in the air meant more fuel consumed, more maintenance required, and more pilots exposed. The attempt to restore effectiveness accelerated depletion. Maintenance and logistics lagged. Aircraft availability dropped even as production continued. New aircraft could not offset the loss of trained pilots and the degradation of ground infrastructure. Airfields became congested and vulnerable. Turnaround times lengthened. The system lost elasticity. The Mustang also shifted where losses occurred. Engagements moved deeper into German airspace and farther from bases. A damaged aircraft had farther to go. Emergency landings became rarer. Ditchings and crashes increased. Each mile of pursuit mattered. Escorts did not need to score a kill in the initial engagement. Persistence finished the job. Psychological strain intensified attrition. Pilots flew knowing they would be contested throughout the mission. Fatigue accumulated. Decision-making degraded. Small errors multiplied. Fear of pursuit altered behavior, often in subtle ways that reduced effectiveness. Conservatism replaced aggression. That conservatism, while rational, further reduced interception success. The Luftwaffe attempted tactical innovations to slow the bleed: mass formations, head-on attacks, rocket-armed interceptors. Some inflicted bomber losses. None reduced pilot attrition sustainably. Head-on attacks shortened exposure time but increased collision risk and demanded precision from increasingly inexperienced pilots. Rocket attacks disrupted formations but did not solve escort persistence. Each adaptation addressed symptoms while leaving the underlying condition intact. The condition was this: the Luftwaffe was being forced to defend everywhere, all the time, against an opponent that could choose engagement ranges and sustain pressure. That is the definition of a losing attritional position. In such a position, even tactical successes accelerate strategic defeat by consuming irreplaceable assets. By late 1944, the consequences were visible in readiness reports. Units listed aircraft on paper that could not be flown for lack of pilots or parts. Training units were cannibalized to staff frontline squadrons. Standards dropped, accident rates rose. The Air Force was still present, still fighting, but no longer regenerating. The bomber offensive benefited directly. With interceptor effectiveness declining, bomber formations maintained cohesion. Flak remained lethal, but it could not compensate for the loss of coordinated fighter attack. Bomb damage accumulated. Industrial disruption compounded logistical shortages, including fuel, feeding back into the Luftwaffe's problems. This feedback loop was decisive. Escort persistence increased fighter attrition. Fighter attrition reduced interception. Reduced interception increased bombing effectiveness. Bombing reduced fuel and infrastructure. Shortages further reduced training and readiness. Readiness declines increased attrition. The Mustang did not create this loop alone, but it closed it. The end state was not a sudden collapse. It was erosion to irrelevance. The Luftwaffe continued to fly, but it no longer shaped outcomes. Air superiority ceased to be contested in any meaningful sense. The question was no longer who controlled the air, but how quickly the remaining German air power would be consumed. In that sense, the Mustang's most important contribution was not tactical dominance, but strategic inevitability. It transformed air combat into a contest of endurance and regeneration, criteria that favored one side overwhelmingly. Once that transformation occurred, outcomes followed mechanically. In the next section, the focus will move to legacy, how this shift redefined air power doctrine, reshaped fighter design priorities, and ended the era of interception-only air defense. By the end of the air war over Europe, the outcome no longer hinged on tactics, bravery, or isolated technical advantages. It hinged on inevitability. The introduction of long-range escort did not simply tilt the balance, it locked the trajectory. Once that happened, German air power could still fight, still inflict losses, but it could no longer influence the direction of the war. The decisive consequence was the collapse of interception as a viable strategic defense. For decades, air defense theory had assumed that bombers could be stopped by interceptors operating close to home bases, supported by ground control and flak. This model required two conditions: limited escort range and predictable engagement zones. When those conditions disappeared, interception ceased to function as a controlling strategy. Long-range escort forced a shift from defense to endurance. German fighters were no longer defending airspace in discrete battles. They were enduring constant pressure across vast distances. That distinction mattered. Defense can be optimized. Endurance exposes structural limits. The Luftwaffe's limits were exposed rapidly. It lacked the pilot replacement depth, fuel reserves, and operational elasticity required for sustained attrition. The Allied system possessed all three. Once escorts stayed with bombers throughout the mission, the air war became a test of regeneration rather than skill. The side that could replace losses faster would win. That realization arrived too late to change outcomes. German industry could still produce aircraft, but production without trained pilots was meaningless. Training without fuel was impossible. Fuel shortages were worsened by bombing, which was itself enabled by escort persistence. The system consumed itself. From the Allied perspective, the change was equally profound. Escort fighters were no longer auxiliary assets. They became the centerpiece of air strategy. Protecting bombers was not about shielding them passively. It was about destroying the enemy's ability to contest the sky. Air superiority ceased to be a local or temporary condition. It became continuous. This redefinition of air superiority had lasting effects. Post-war doctrine abandoned the idea that air control could be achieved intermittently. Control had to be maintained everywhere, all the time, or it would be lost. Fighters were no longer designed solely to intercept. They were designed to range, persist, and dominate airspace over long distances. Aircraft design priorities shifted accordingly. Range, reliability, and pilot endurance became as important as speed and climb. Fuel capacity was no longer an afterthought. Avionics, navigation, and pilot ergonomics gained prominence. The lesson was clear: an aircraft that cannot stay cannot decide. The legacy extended beyond design into training and force structure. Air forces reorganized around the assumption of continuous presence. Pilot training emphasized sustained operations, situational awareness over long missions, and coordination across large formations. The idea of short, decisive intercepts gave way to protracted aerial campaigns. Another enduring consequence was psychological. The air war demonstrated that morale follows structural advantage. German pilots did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they were placed in a system that offered no relief. Fatigue, stress, and attrition eroded effectiveness faster than any tactical defeat. The Allied system, by contrast, absorbed losses without collapse. This understanding reshaped how air forces thought about pilot welfare, rotation, and rest. Endurance warfare demanded institutional care, not just individual heroism. The Mustang era exposed the limits of relying on elite skill without systemic support. The bomber offensive itself was transformed. With reliable escort, bombers could operate with greater cohesion and predictability. Loss rates declined relative to sortie volume. Accuracy improved. Strategic targets were struck repeatedly. The bombing campaign became cumulative rather than episodic. Industrial disruption reached thresholds that could not be repaired. This did not mean bombing alone won the war. It meant that air superiority made other forms of power possible. Ground operations, logistics interdiction, and strategic pressure all benefited from control of the sky. The Mustang's role was not to end the war directly, but to remove the enemy's ability to contest its ending. The most important legacy lies in what did not return after the war. The era of interception-only air defense never came back. No modern Air Force assumes it can protect its airspace solely by waiting for attackers to arrive. Forward presence, early engagement, and continuous control are now standard assumptions. That shift traces directly to the lessons learned over Europe. The laughter that greeted the Mustang's early appearances was not foolish. It was based on experience in a different kind of war. What changed was not perception, but reality. When the battlefield expanded beyond expectations, old judgments became liabilities. The Mustang proved that winning air wars is not about building the fastest or most heavily armed fighter in isolation. It is about building the system that forces the enemy to fight on unfavorable terms, continuously, until collapse becomes inevitable. In the end, the Luftwaffe did not lose because it was outflown in every engagement. It lost because it was outlasted. The sky became a place without edges, without pauses, and without refuge. In that environment, only one outcome was possible. If you want fact-driven breakdowns of aircraft, weapons, and battles that didn't just win engagements, but made entire outcomes inevitable, subscribe to WW2 Battles.